All right, we're good. Well, good morning, everybody. Good to see all of you out here this morning. We are on the last chapter of the book of Acts, chapter 28. Yeah. Now, the microphone's just reminded me, we're trying out these new audience microphones. They're kind of like, if you've ever been to a choir and you see the little microphones hanging from the ceiling above the choir, that's essentially what these are supposed to be. They're supposed to be able to pick up the audience. So we're
testing.
Yeah. So there we go. Whenever you're reading, if you just try to read clearly and project a little bit, it should be able to pick that up. And the hopeful advantage of that is that people at home will be able to hear. Maybe depending on where you are in the room, if you're over here and someone's in the back there, the microphone will pick it up and the speakers will make it easier for them to hear. So we're going to give these a try over the next couple weeks. But just bear with us because we're still balancing out all the microphone settings. And we're trying to avoid it making feedback sounds and getting super loud like that. So hopefully, I think I can hear it a little bit. But hopefully that won't rear its. I guess not.
Justice, even that one, if you could speak more directly into it.
Okay.
Move it to a place where
I might just move it a little closer. I'll definitely need help reading because if some of you guys can hear it, I've had something the last almost week or so that's making it a little harder to speak and whatnot, and I've been congested. So we'll have a couple opportunities to read. Probably, I think I have at least 5 or 6 different times. So if people would be willing to chime in on that, it'd be appreciated. So, getting into the passage for today, we're in Acts 28, and in the previous chapters, we finished Acts chapter 26 with Paul having appealed to Caesar. He went before King Agrippa. They confirmed his appeal, and they recognized that if he hadn't appealed to Caesar, he would have been a free man, because he was not guilty of anything that the Jewish leaders had accused him of doing at the temple. So he, in chapter 27, departs with the ship. He is a prisoner on board an Alexandrian vessel. It's a very large, a very slow kind of cargo vessel. And they're making their way through the Mediterranean. They go up to south of Asia Minor. They stop by Crete. And then when they're headed out, trying to head towards the bottom of the Italian peninsula so they can turn up towards Rome, a particularly bad storm comes up and it results in a shipwreck. Now, we've seen that Paul told the guards to cut away the lifeboats because some of the crew members were going to try to escape on some of the lifeboats. And Paul told them if they leave the ship, they're not going to survive in the storm. And so the Roman soldiers cut the lifeboats free, so everyone was left on board. And then finally the storm started to rip the ship apart, and so the different people started grabbing whatever they could that would float, and they head towards land, because there's land pretty nearby. It's the island of Malta. That's what we see here in verse 1. So I'll start by reading verses 1 to 3. It says, "When they had been brought safely through, then we found out that the island was called Malta. The natives showed us extraordinary kindness, for because of the rain that had set in and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out of the heat and fastened itself on his hand." This island of Malta, it's a little island just south of Sicily. I'm sure many of you have heard it before. I remember back in one of the VeggieTales episodes with Minnesota Cuke, they pull a funny joke about him being in that southern region of the world, and he or in that region of the world, and he asks someone at an ice cream shop for a chocolate malt. The funny little thing there, but we see that there is kind of a miraculous thing going on here, which is that all of the people on board are brought safely onto shore despite a massive sea storm. And there's a couple indications that God has a hand in this. The first is just a matter of probability, that you have a large storm, a lot of people have to swim to shore, when many of them are told grab onto something that can float, because very few people at that time knew how to swim. That indicates that God is working something here. The second thing is the beginning of the first verse says, when they had been brought safely through. Now, some translations, like the NIV, just say more once safely on shore. But I like the way the NASB and some of the more literal translations indicate that Paul and the other people on board are being brought through this storm. I think that's a good indication that God is the one preserving everyone and bringing them safely onto shore. And it confirms what Paul said to the soldiers and the heads of the boat. He had told them that God has spoken to me and told me that because I've appealed for all of you, we're not going to lose anyone on this voyage, so long as they stay on board. And it appears that's exactly what happens. Now, there's a fun competing theory about what island this was, but it's not particularly important for us. Some people thought it was northwest of Greece instead of very far southwest. But the indication from the passage that there's a northern wind blowing them along that goes from north towards the south means it's very unlikely they swung up around Crete and went towards the Greek islands. So there's that. And then we see that they meet people on the island. It calls them natives. What's funny, some older translations, because the Greek word for it is barbaroi, which is kind of like where we get the term barbarian. I believe this one's a little bit more of just a neutral word of people who live there on the island. Some of the older translations will say when the barbarians had met us on the island, which I find a little humorous. But we see that these are very decent people. When they see the shipwreckies here on the island, they decide to lend a helping hand to them. They help them get a fire ready, which would have been very appreciated. Imagine you've come out of the water, you've been swimming for however long it's been, and you're wet and you're cold and you're probably hungry as well. Warm fire is going to go a long way towards cheering up the spirits of these men. And so it's a very considerate thing for them. Now, the thing that no one notices is amongst the wood that they're using to heat this fire, there was a snake coiled up sleeping or something. But when that wood gets driven in the fire, it drives the snake out and it bites Paul on the hand. Now, the word there for viper is generally used to indicate a venomous or poisonous snake. So, and you can tell from the natives' reactions, they know that this snake that latched on to Paul's hand is a very dangerous one because of what they say in the next three verses. Could I get a volunteer for verses 4 through 6? All right, Mr. Watkins.
When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god.
Well, so we see here a couple things that are not new to Paul's experiences. One is some kind of hardship that God delivers him from. Obviously with the snake there. We see from the reaction in verse 4 and 6, it's unmistakable the people believed that this was a dangerous snake, that all else being equal, without God playing a role in it, Paul would have died from this snake. Another fun thing we see, because what is expected doesn't happen, the people jump to the conclusion that he is a god. We've seen this before back in Acts 14 when he and Barnabas visit, I believe it's Derbe. It's either Iconium, Lystra, or Derbe on the first missionary journey. Because of the way that they speak and because of the healings and signs that they do, the people believe that they're gods being sent, or rather sending themselves. So he's not dealing with particularly new things here. But what is interesting and a pretty good lesson for us here in verse 4 is this kind of view about justice that you see. And there are some different views about how justice in the world works. And so we have this one here where some people believe that if you do something wrong, you're definitely going to receive a punishment for it in this life. There's more, what I believe to be the Christian view is more that if you do wrong things, sometimes it is punished in this life just by natural consequences, but it will definitely be punished at the final judgment. I think both normal experience and the Bible itself indicate the latter is the proper view of justice. Think of the book of Job. If it's true that bad things happen to bad people in this life, and that generally goes along with the view that if people do good in this life, they're going to receive good in this life. For that to be necessarily the case, I think we'd have to discount the entire book of Job as a result of that, because we see a very upright and godly man receive bad things for a time, and the indication of that is because it's a trial to help him grow spiritually and to be better. And ultimately, in the end, he does receive more and receives a greater reward. So that's more the view of justice that the Bible teaches. Here we have this other predominant view, though, that if you've done wrong, you're going to receive wrong. And that's what the villagers or the natives come to here. The reason they believe this is because they must know from having talked to the people there, or having seen that you have some centurions, some people may still have chains on them. The indication of them is that they were transporting criminals. When they see that a serpent bites Paul's hand, they're like, oh, this man must have been a criminal. He was so bad that not only did that he was sent into a shipwreck. When he survived the shipwreck, this snake came along to finish the job. So they come to that realization. Then, of course, Paul, he's bitten. God saves him from that bite, and then he literally just shakes it off. He shakes the snake right into the fire, and it says he suffers no harm. And so when they see that he's not dying as they expect, they turn 180 from this man is the lowest of people and a criminal to this man is a god. So and we've already talked with the problems about this back in chapter 14. Paul, as usual, gets right on the job of demonstrating to them he's not a god. He's a man just like they are. And we're going to see that he does use this opportunity for a lot of great things on the island. But the last thing before we move on from this is that we kind of see here with Paul's story an allusion to something Jesus said was going to happen to his apostles and his messengers that he sends out in Mark chapter 16. Could I get a volunteer for Mark 16 verses 17 to 18? Don't everybody raise your hand at once. All right, Mr. Watkins.
15 to 17?
Sorry, Mark chapter 16, verses 17 to 18.
Chapter 16.
Yeah, sorry. Does it not?
Oh, I'm not in that place.
Yeah.
Okay.
he's still in.
I didn't know. There's a slim possibility some Bibles will start cutting it out because
No, I have it, I just didn't,
He didn't have it.
there's questions over exactly how old. I believe it's verses 9 to 20.
Mark 16, right? Chapter 16.
Yep.
Verse 1,
Or verse 17 to 18.
17 and 8. All right, I'm there. Sorry, folks. And these signs, is that the right one?
Yep.
These signs will accompany those who believe. In my name, they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up serpents with their hands. And if they will not hurt them, they will lay their hands on the sick and they will recover.
Thanks. I think it's pretty safe to say we've seen all of these now in the book of Acts with this story about Paul, except maybe, I don't know if we've directly seen someone drink poison, but Paul certainly got a good dose of that with the snake bite. We see all throughout this that this prophecy of Jesus is coming to fruition. These men, on the day of Pentecost, they were speaking in tongues. So we've seen them speaking in all different kinds of languages by a kind of miraculous power, in that these men didn't spend time studying these languages. It was specially given to them the ability to communicate with people whose language they didn't know. We've seen them healing all kinds of people, driving demons out. Both Peter and Paul have done this on numerous occasions. And then here we see this bit about they'll pick up serpents. And we see that Paul has had this run-in with a snake and come out of it completely fine. In, I believe, fulfillment of the prophecies of Jesus. Now, moving on from that, I'll read the next 4 verses, verses 7 to 10. This is about the rest of the time in Malta. It says, "Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to a leading man of the island named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously 3 days. It happened that the father of Publius was lying in bed afflicted with recurring fever and dysentery, and Paul went in to see him, and after he had prayed, he laid his hands on him and healed him. After this had happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to him and getting cured. They also honored us with many marks of respect, and when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all we needed." Now, verse 11 is going to tell them, in grand total, they're spending about 3 months on this island. And we'll see why that's important for Paul's ministry in a moment. But we see that because of the snake incident, Paul, his name starts to spread around the island. He comes to meet this leading man of the island named Publius. We again see a further fulfillment of what Jesus said, that he was going to send Paul to stand before kings and authorities, kings and governors. And Publius is something like a governor of this island. When Paul heals Publius' father, it opens up a floodgate level of evangelistic opportunity on that island for Paul. Suddenly everyone on the island is coming to see Paul. They're coming because they hear that he can heal him. And we just know from Paul's character, he uses that as an opportunity to point them to Christ. Now, an interesting thing about this miracle is that it was curing a pretty well-known disease for that island. I don't know how many of you have heard of the name Hippocrates. Have you guys heard of Hippocrates? He's considered the father of Greek medicine. He, in some of the records that we have of the things he wrote about, he knew of the very kind of affliction that was afflicting Publius' father. I have it. This was a quote that Reese had from Hippocrates. He said, quote, "Malta has long had a peculiarly unpleasant fever of its own, Malta fever, due to a microbe in goat's milk." So they both knew that there is a particularly annoying type of fever on the island of Malta, and they even had some inclination as to the cause of this kind of fever. And so I think it's a pretty neat tidbit from history there that this was a known problem afflicting the island, and Paul's able to, with God's help, he can cure it with ease, and it provides a great opportunity for it. And then again, we've also talked about before the purpose of a lot of these miracles, and we see it working out perfectly with how many people are flocking to Paul to receive healing, is that these miracles help to confirm the words of the one who's sent. And that's what Paul's able to do here. Virtually no one on the island would be able to dispute anything that he says at this point.
Are you going to get to the difference between the two different words used, healing versus cure?
No, I didn't pick up on that.
So not real obvious in the English, but the first instance when he heals Publius, it uses a word that is a stand-in for miracle, miraculous healing.
Yeah.
The other word, the others came to them and they cured them, is a word that is typically used for natural healing.
Oh.
Where Luke is a doctor, he may have known how to remedy this, and so it wasn't necessary for Paul to do a miracle for every person. The one who was very sick at the beginning is the one the miracle was done for. The rest is
Interesting.
natural medicine.
Okay, I did not know about that. Thank you.
That would still be a miracle to them. 'Cause they didn't
Yeah.
have a cure.
I think you could still argue the providence of it all with having,
Yeah.
if it is true that because Luke is there, he's able to cure these all through natural means. That's still a providential event
Well, and it's
by any
also,
stretch.
it shows that, having that kind of physical aspect to a ministry is very legitimate.
Yeah.
A lot of missionaries, a lot of people, we've started hospitals around the world in the name of Christ, and medical missions is a great way to evangelize.
Yeah, I think you see that in a lot of different mission works. That's one of the first things that, beside, probably the only thing I think that could rival it is schools. Schools and hospitals are two of the things that Christians are most known for setting up in a mission field. And we see precedent for that going all the way back to here. So naturally, we see because of what Paul and Luke were able to do on the island, the people of Malta are very appreciative for them. They help to outfit the ship that ultimately takes Paul up to Rome. Could I get a volunteer for verses 11 through 16? Pat.
Yeah. At the end of 3 months, we set sail on an Alexandrian ship, which had wintered at the island, and which had the twin brothers for its figurehead. After we had put in at Syracuse, we stayed there for 3 days. From there, we sailed around and arrived to Rhegium. And a day later, a south wind sprang up, and on the second day, we came to Ptolemy. There we found some brethren and were invited to stay with them for 7 days, and thus we came to Rome. How far?
Verse 16.
Okay. And the brethren, when they heard about us, came from there as far as the market of Apollos and 3 inns to meet us. And when Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. When we entered Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who was guarding him.
Thanks.
One more?
That'll be good for the moment. So we see here Paul, he has 3 months where he's on the island of Malta They're working to heal the people. They're spreading the gospel, and this would have made a great impact on the island. And there's still a very strong believing presence on the island to this day. Most of it is either Christian or Catholic.
And don't forget, there's 276 of these individuals that were shipwrecked. There's a lot
Yeah.
of people. You got soldiers and sailors and who else, and the prisoners.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of people to take care of for that amount of time.
Yeah, and it's actually another interesting thing about Malta. There might be less people on the island at this time, so it's not as big of a problem. But later on, throughout Middle Ages and later on, most of the people there are going to be able to survive because they import food onto the island, and it kind of provides the island in return functions as a safe haven for a lot of different kinds of sailors and fun kinds of sailors called corsairs, who are a type of religious pirate, are later going to populate the island of Malta. But they helped to outfit Paul's ship, and I think the reason he would have gotten a lot of evangelism done here is simply because the island of Malta is not all that large. I checked the square mileage of it. It's about 122 square miles. The city of Pittsburgh is only about 58 square miles. So we're talking about 2 Pittsburghs. 3 months to work there. So he's going to get to talk to a lot of people and leave a very lasting impact on the island. What's also interesting is that they disembark on the same type of vessel that they had left, or that they had been shipwrecked on. They get another Alexandrian ship, same kind of cargo ship, and this time they have a good sailing route, and they just have to head straight north past Sicily, and they're going to end up in Rome. Now, do you guys know who it says the twins, the twin brothers, do you know who that's referring to?
Gemini?
Yeah, Gemini.
Well, there's a lot of famous twins, right? Castor and Pollux. And
That's Gemini.
okay, Romulus
Sim-
and Remus.
Well, I guess Romulus and Remus is a famous one as well. The reason it's likely the twin brothers, though, is because they become known as kind of they don't have saints in the Greek myths, but they're kind of the patron gods of seafarers because of the stories about them. One, Castor, it doesn't seem obvious that it would be the case at first, because Castor is known for being a horse breeder, and Pollux is known for being a boxer. Sometimes both of them have divine blood in them. Sometimes neither of them have divine blood. Sometimes only Pollux is divine until he asks Zeus to make Castor divine on his behalf. And as a result of things that happen in their deification, Pisidian, as the story goes, gives them the gift and ability to control the winds and the waves. And so that's why they become known as these patron gods. And so it actually makes a lot of sense that they would carve an image of these two onto the Greek ships that would sail around the Mediterranean. And I've already mentioned the constellation that they have. We still refer to it today as Gemini, because someone years ago thought that for some reason you can pick out these 10 or 11 stars and it means twins. It's still lost to me how most of the constellations, except for the Great Dipper, got their name.
Yeah,
The Great Dipper looks like
Big Dipper and Little.
those two look like what they're named for, but the other ones, sorry for the digression, but the other ones, like the Big Dipper is part of the torso and the tail of Ursa Major, but I don't know how they looked up at the sky and thought, yes, a bear. So that doesn't have too much with what we're talking But then, and last fun fact about these two that I'll mention is that according to legend, their sister is Helen of Troy, who is infamous for being the face that launched 1,000 ships, and results in the whole story of the Iliad. But a clear indication that we receive from this is that just as throughout most of Paul's journeys, there's still a strong influence of paganism that he's having to fight here and having to oppose. And naturally, some of it is as a result of he's still moving in the direction where little Christianity has been spread thus far. The reason I say little and not none is because we see that there are already brothers in the city of Rome, because when he arrives at Rome, he's going to be met by some of them. So we already have missionaries heading towards Rome, but Paul's presence here is going to just increase the power of their efforts. So we have these remaining stops. They move up, or they set sail from Malta and head up to Syracuse, Sicily. That's right in between, or that's right on the edge of Sicily, facing the tip of the boot of Italy. And they go by Rhegium, that's now called Reggio, which is on the point of the boot of Italy. And then it says they get a favorable south wind, and that carries them past what are called the Straits of Messina. And for all of the Greek and Roman sailors on board, having a strong south wind at that part of the Mediterranean would be particular. You want the south wind to push you up towards Rome. They've already been harnessing that. The second thing is the Straits of Messina is where their legends say that there are these two monsters, Caridibus and Scolla, that on one side it was a whirlpool, that Caridibus was this monstrous whirlpool that would suck in any ships that got too close. And on the other side are these cliffs where this monster Scolla resided, and if you got too close, Scolla would come and eat some of the men who were on board. And it was, in their mind, a favorable south wind was what was needed to skirt a happy medium between the whirlpool and the man-eater, and that would allow them to get to Rome safely. So they do eventually get up there with the help of that south wind, and I would imagine it would make the trip easier, because having so many crew members that would still be very inculcated in their pagan beliefs and traditions, having that would have just made an easier journey, because it would have calmed a lot of their fears, made the sailing to Rome easier. Now it says they stop over at a place called Petioli. There's a couple fun ways you could pronounce that. They get to visit some of the brothers there for about a week right before they get to Italy. And some interesting Christian tradition about Petuli is that Apollos was there for a time. And it goes in hand with, there's some people who will argue that Apollos is the one who writes the book of Hebrews, and that he's writing back to where he's from, where there were a lot of Jews. If you recall, they said that Apollos knew the scriptures well, but at the time he had only known the baptism of John, and he was constantly arguing with the Jews in the synagogues, and much like Paul and Stephen, was very effective against the different arguments they would bring up against Christianity. So there are some who believe that Apollos was one of the first Christians to come out and start evangelizing in the region of Rome. Petulio's only a little bit away from Rome, and some think that while he was there, he wrote the book of Hebrews back to the place where he was from. He's from somewhere around, I'm trying to remember, I think it's Asia Minor and Crete, somewhere between there. But that's one of the beliefs as to how Christianity first reached there. And then in verse 15 it mentions these, this is where we get back into some of the evidence of the historical detail that Luke has. These markets of Appius, they're also known as the Appiforums. They're about 45 miles away from Rome. We know where those are. The three inns were about 33 miles away. We know where those are. Luke, it's a good reminder of the confidence we have in the history of Acts here, is that Luke is listing very specific places that would have been within about 1 to 1.5 days walk for Christians in the surrounding regions to come and visit Paul when he arrives in Rome. So it gives us a lot of confidence, again, in the veracity of this book. Now, Paul arrives there, and the implication we see at the end of verse 16 is that he is under house arrest. It says he is allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who was guarding him. So he's not in a prison like a lot of prisoners, which wouldn't have required some kind of special permission like he received here. And part of the reason he receives this, and it ends up working out to his benefit immensely, is because it's already been established from the trials he's had before Agrippa and Festus that he's not a particularly guilty man. He's not responsible for causing riots and uprisings. He's just there literally because he appealed to Caesar when he had the opportunity. So they don't have much of a worry that he's going to cause trouble in Rome. To use a more modern term, he's not any kind of flight risk. And then that brings us to verses 17 to 22. Can we get a volunteer for those verses? All right, Carol, thank you.
After 3 days, he called together the local leaders of the Jews, and when they had gathered, he said to them, "Brothers, though I had done nothing against our people or the country, that I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. When they examined me, they wished to set me at liberty, because there was no reason for the death penalty in my case. But because the Jews objected, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar, though I had no charge to bring against my nation. For this reason, therefore, I have asked to see you and speak with you, since it is because of the hope of Israel that I am wearing this chain." And they said to him, "We have received no letters from Judea about you, and none of the brothers coming here has reported or spoken any evil about you. But we desire to hear from you what your views are, for with regard to this sect, we know that everywhere it is spoken against."
Thank you. So we see Paul trying to do the best he can with how he normally approaches evangelism in a new city despite being under house arrest. Because as we all know, his usual plan is he likes to start by going to the synagogue, talking to the Jews in the city, and then he'll start talking to the Gentiles after that. Well, naturally, being under house arrest, he can't go visit the synagogue and talk to the Jews that way. So he has this invitation, they accept it, and he gets to meet with the prominent Jews of the city. What's also kind of nice is for the first time since he finished his third missionary journey, went back to Judea, the kind of pesky Jews from Asia Minor who followed him everywhere have finally stopped following him. So he's, for the first time in a very long time, he almost has a blank slate with the Jews in the region, and so it makes it easier for him to talk to them. They're able to approach what he says with a more open mind. And it's also good to see that they're open to hearing what Paul has to say about the gospel. Now, while they do, and I think we should very much commend them in their virtue for this open mind, they have also heard at least a little bit about Christianity in a negative light. So Paul's going to have a little bit of a hurdle to overcome, but it's not going to be anywhere near as bad as it usually is. Then, with that, I'll read verse 23 through 29. What we're going to see here is Paul, since he can't preach in the synagogue, he kind of just invites everyone to come listen outside his house, and he preaches a fairly long sermon there. It says, when they had set a day for Paul, they came to him at his lodging in large numbers, and he was explaining to them by solemnly testifying about the kingdom of God and trying to persuade them concerning Jesus from both the law of Moses and from the prophets from morning until evening. So he's spending a very long time doing his preaching, and we know this is not abnormal of Paul either. He, several chapters back, when he raises Eutychus from the dead, he had been preaching another all-day sermon at that time. Verse 24, some were being persuaded by the things spoken, but others would not believe. When they did not agree with one another, they began leaving after Paul had spoken one parting word. The Holy Spirit rightly spoke through Isaiah the prophet to your fathers, saying, go to this people and say, you will keep on hearing, but will not understand. You will keep on seeing, but will not perceive. For the heart of this people has become dull, and with their ears they scarcely hear. They have closed their eyes, otherwise they might see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and return, and I would heal them. Therefore let it be known to you that this salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles, and they will also listen. When he had spoken these words, the Jews departed, having a great dispute amongst themselves. All right. So with Paul's closing here, there can sometimes be a temptation to read it too hard and think that none of the Jews are listening to him. And so that's why he's kind of sending out this final warning as they leave. I believe that's only half true. He is sending a warning to some of them as they're leaving. But clearly not all of them have been turned off, because it says that a dispute is arising within the Jews in Rome as to what Paul says. So it means some of them are believing. Some of them aren't and are pushing back against that, which is pretty natural. I think it's a fair thing we can expect in any evangelistic ministry we face, that some people are going to listen and some people aren't going to listen. So very much like how Paul transitions from speaking just to the Jews in his region to also talking to Gentiles, we see here, after he gives his warning to the Jews who aren't listening, salvation is also for the Gentiles. And so it's still following Paul's usual ministry path that he follows in any city that he comes to. And then finally, it closes out with verse 30 and 31. It says, and he stayed 2 full years in his own rented quarters and was welcoming all who came to him, preaching the kingdom of God and teaching concerning the Lord Jesus Christ with all openness, unhindered. Now, I do have a question here with that. What is weird about saying that Paul is preaching unhindered?
Well, he gets to preach with a Roman guard right there. No one's going to cause any trouble. I mean, there could be some, there could be some disagreement, but there's not going to be an open riot like happened a few times. So it's kind of providential that he's able to preach in this situation of being a prisoner, a Roman prisoner, because no one's going to cause a riot. They can disagree all they want, but they're not going to riot.
Yeah.
To kill him.
I think that presents a very good reason for why he has a fairly peaceable environment for these next 2 years while under house arrest. The thing I found funny about it, saying that he's preaching unhindered, is that he's under house arrest. He can't leave the boundaries of his house and what maybe little, I don't know if they had fenced in property in Rome in those days, but there's a very small area that Paul has to live in. He can't leave that. And yet his preaching is so effective and so many people come to hear him that it says he is preaching the word unhindered, which I think is a good encouragement for us, because sometimes I can find evangelism and speaking to my friends and what they might think as a result of the things I have to say, sometimes I can find that a little scary in my mind. But I think it's a good comfort for us that we can see someone who is literally held to a small parcel of land. It's the only place that he can go to. And yet it describes Paul as being able to preach unhindered. And of course, that's, it doesn't have it in this version. Sometimes instead of with all openness unhindered, sometimes it says with all boldness unhindered. And that simply indicates all openness, all boldness. Paul is not afraid to speak the things that he has to say to people. And he's being very open, very forward with presenting the gospel to others. A very good example for us. I forgot I skipped over a brief illustration I had regarding it that I'll just briefly mention before we close out. Most of you, I hope all of you know the name James A. Garfield, 20th President of the United States. He was a disciple of Christ preacher before he became president, and that is, at the time, that was the Restoration Movement church, just like the one that we have here. It was interesting because of the way that they were able to campaign in those days. All he had to do was stand out on his porch, deliver a speech, and all the newspapers would take it and disseminate it throughout the country. So he literally did his entire presidential campaign from his front porch in Ohio. So I thought it was just a neat comparison to what Paul did. Obviously, Paul, I think, has something a little bit more important here than a campaign speech. So that is, that's what Paul's doing as we close the verse-by-verse portion of the study of Acts here. We see he's preaching the gospel. It's something that's been foremost and central throughout the entire book of Acts, so it's only fitting that they end on that note. The general tradition regarding what happens to Paul is that he's going to be in Jerusalem for a couple years. He'll get to speak to Caesar, and he'll be set free for several years, during which time he'll continue preaching and traveling around the Roman world. We see in some of his letters that he writes that he hopes to go to Spain at one point. So many do believe he eventually got to go over and minister in Spain and establish some of the first churches there. Maybe France, or what would be called Gaul at that time along the way. He gets to stop there. Then eventually he'll be arrested and brought back to Rome a second time, speak before Caesar again, and that time he's going to be beheaded. But that is the conclusion to what we've gotten to see, with the first half being about Peter. Now the second half of the book of Acts focuses a lot on what Paul does in the early church. So I think it's certainly a great book for us to study, receive a lot of encouragement about it. Now, we're not completely done with the book of Acts yet. There are some particular things along the way that we see woven throughout, and we're going to be doing a couple more special studies for the next couple weeks where we're going to get to pick out some of these things like baptism, similar to what we did back in one of the very first weeks, where we took a week and just talked about the meaning of baptism of the Holy Spirit. Some of you remember that. It's going to be kind of similar to that. We're going to pick out some important themes, important topics throughout the book, and we're going to cover those before we completely finish up the book of Acts. So we look forward to doing that with all of you over the next couple weeks. And with that, we'll go ahead, or I guess I should ask, are there any final questions before we close with prayer? No? All right.